This is my son, Ian. Trent told him he had to sit on the stage so and wait his turn. But I started, when we were talking about me talking, I got all nervous. I'm like, for a half an hour, what am I going to say for a half an hour? Well, now I'm worried that I won't get to say everything that I want to say in a half an hour. I'm going to talk about the community impact from government overreach. Everybody knows of Harney County now, Burns, Oregon, Malheur Wildlife Refuge. But I wanted to kind of give more of a history of how we got to where we are today. Excuse me. The Hammond situation, the Malheur Refuge occupation, it didn't happen in a vacuum. It took 100 years for things to build up to the point that it was at a couple years ago. So I'm going to start with, we're going to go through history of our county, and I think history is incredibly important. So, and I have lots of slideshows, and you'll get to see pictures of my family because I'm a mom and all that. But we're going to talk about Harney County and where it's at. It's in southeastern Oregon. It's the 10th largest county in the continental United States, and it's also the least populated. It's about 7,500 people reside in the county, and the county is 10,228 square miles. 60% of those 7,500 people live in the towns of Burns and Hines, which are essentially the same town. They run together. You can't tell where one stops and one begins. I also wanted to say quick before I forget, because she'll get mad at me, my 12-year-old daughter put together this PowerPoint because I was thinking slides like 1970s slides, and so she did this PowerPoint. Harney County is located in the high desert, which is part of the Great Basin. Contrary to propaganda by environmental groups, Harney County was not some Eden-like utopia before white men set foot on this land. Although it's a beautiful country. Between the natural marshes and small streams lies mostly waterless expanse that can go hundreds of miles. This handsome man here is Peter Skeen Ogden. He was one of the many fur trappers and fur traders that went through the Northwest and made 2 treks into Harney County. Men like him articulated in their diaries how barren and treacherous this landscape I call home is, or was. They documented very little wildlife. There was no deer at the time, no elk, no sage grouse. They only encountered the occasional antelope, and they survived on eating rabbits, rodents, lizards, plant bulbs, and insects. And more often than not, they survived their journey through the desert by resorting to eating their mules, horses, and dogs. Early on, in the mid-1800s, the government began enticing settlers to come into this country west of the Rockies with various homestead acts in order to further westward expansion. Pioneers like these people in these photographs began occupying this harsh country, and my husband's ancestors were among them. In the late 1800s, a man by the name of Pete French became one of the first men to bring thousands of cattle from California, around this country, to Harney County. Pete French settled in the Blitzen Valley at the base of the Steens Mountain, which is now the Malheur Wildlife Refuge. Tens of thousands, or about 50,000 cattle used to run where the refuge sits today. Pete French and many other cattlemen across the Great Basin enlisted Mexican cowboys called vaqueros to drive their vast cattle herds north. Vaqueros had a great impact on cattlemen throughout the Great Basin, and that remains today. the term vaquero morphed into buckaroo. Being a buckaroo is not just an occupation. It is a lifestyle and a culture. Sorry. A couple years ago, my husband's grandfather, Bob Maupin, was inducted into the Buckaroo Hall of Fame. And although he's long since passed, his legacy lives on. This is a picture of my husband, Jeff, my son, Ian, my son, Cade, and my daughter, Cassie, getting ready to gather to brand. Here's some more pictures of all of us doing what ranchers do. My son on the left is Cade. He's in that picture, he was 16, and he's doing what he loves more than anything in the world, roping calves. In the middle is my sister and I gathering cattle on the Steens Mountain in the fall about 5 years ago. And the little girl is my daughter, Cassie, who created this PowerPoint. And that was the first calf she roped. She's holding him at the brand fire. After the cowmen paved the way, then came the sheepmen. Basque, Scottish, Irish, and Welsh immigrants came to herd sheep. Another one of my husband's grandfathers were among these men. He came from Wales to herd sheep for his uncle who owned a ranch in Harney County. He said when he arrived by train to Eastern Oregon, it was so dry and desolate, he said if he'd had enough money, he'd have hopped right back on the train and headed back to Wales. But he stayed and eventually owned his own ranch. As early as 1908, the government began a more than century-long process of taking land away from those hard-working Americans they were trying to give it to just decades before. In 1908, through the Antiquities Act, President Teddy Roosevelt created the National Wildlife Refuge. The logging boom reached Harney County in the 1920s. And you're thinking, okay, you just told me you lived in a desert. Well, the high desert is at the base of the Blue Mountains, which is rich in merchantable timber. This is a picture of the Edward Hines Lumber Company near Burns. It was once the largest pine mill in the lower 48. Harney County at one time was the richest county in Oregon. And this was achieved by utilizing our natural resources. We had a thriving timber industry, thriving cattle and sheep industries, and there was a lot of mining going on too in the southern part of the county. This is the mill today. In fact, the one with the smokestack, Ian took that picture on his way home from school on day before yesterday. But you might wonder, well, what happened? How come you're not producing lumber anymore? This is what happened. The environmental movement began in the 1960s and 70s. They found a way to stop the logging industry by using the Spotted Owl, the Endangered Species Act, and the Equal Access to Justice Act. The spotted owl is not indigenous to Eastern Oregon, but all logging after this stopped in the Pacific Northwest. The old growth timber, marketable timber, became off limits to logging. This was devastating to the economy in Harney County, but we were more fortunate than other counties in that we still had a livestock industry. Cattle was still king. The environmentalists did not stop by destroying the logging industry. They were just beginning to perfect their technique of destroying all resource users. On the list of who's next were cattle ranchers who owned grazing allotments on federally administered land. The environmentalist motto at this time in the early 90s was cow free by 93. In Oregon and probably Nevada, you could see these bumper stickers on a lot of Subarus. At this time, during the Cow Free by 93 process, they were using fish species as fodder this time. Many ranchers lost their grazing allotments or the use of those permanently. Fences were put up around streams and water bodies and was off limits to livestock grazing. The next thing to happen in our county was the Steens Mountain Act. At the end of the Clinton era, then Department of Interior Secretary Bruce Babbitt threatened to declare the Steens Mountain, this is top of Steens Mountain, the Steens Mountain a national monument. At this time, my husband's family owned a grazing allotment on the Steens. Through a collaborative process, ranchers who were afraid of losing everything worked with environmentalists to form what is now known as the Steens Mountain and Management and Protection Act of 2000. Through this act, ranchers pacified environmental groups and agencies by trading their grazing allotments and private land on top of the mountain for private land in the desert at lower elevations. The only ranchers that refused to trade, the only ranchers that had large tracts of private inholdings that refused to trade was the Hammond family. After the Steens Act was signed into law, the ink wasn't even dry, and the environmentalists continue to sue. The BLM refused to uphold some of the agreements they made through the act. And the author of that act, Congressman Greg Walden, publicly expressed his frustration that only the ranchers were upholding their end of the bargain. Soon, 2 of those ranchers would be tried and convicted as domestic terrorists. About 5 years ago, my husband's family sold their grazing allotment on the Steens Mountain. And Jeff and I bought a ranch on the other end of the county. And with a grazing allotment it was just desert. There was no live water. On 20,000 acres, there's no live water. We have a couple of wells to water livestock. And not many people wanted this. But Jeff and I, after spending a decade on the Steens Mountain together, dealing with all that was up there, we were happy because not even the environmentalists wanted it. So we thought they would leave us alone. But we were wrong. Enter the sage grouse. The sage grouse was the next to be used by the environmentalists from their never ever expanding list of what I call the Species of the Month Club. This is kind of a funny story. Hopefully I'm not going to get way off track. But this is Dave. I don't know if you can see that. Dave is in school. Dave the sage grouse showed up at our little rural schoolhouse. It's a 2-room schoolhouse. There's 10 kids. Dave shows up. This threatened species, right? He comes in, eats lunch. He played with the kids. He stuck around for a few months. He ended up at our place when we were shipping calves, and there was snow on the ground. There was a truck from Iowa that was getting his gate set on the inside of the truck, and Dave walks in with him into the truck, and the guy says, "What's that?" And I said, "Oh, you need one of those in Iowa." And he sat around the fire we had by the scales and ate donuts like everybody else. But he eventually moved on or became coyote bait. I don't know what happened to Dave. But during the Obama administration, the BLM drafted and passed a huge sage grouse plan that would be the spotted owl of desert areas of the western United States. Livestock grazing use was going to be detrimentally affected and probably wiped out in some areas. Even though the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the BLM admit that grazing was not a causal factor in the decline of the species. In fact, sage-grouse populations reached their peak in the 1940s. And coincidentally, as livestock grazing was at its peak, and then as livestock grazing continued to decline, so did the sage-grouse population, until both are at their lowest levels today. But once again, the livestock industry in Harney County was forced to defend their property rights. But this time, it would be even harder and it would be worse. And the reason is this. After the Steens Act in Harney County, several ranchers became part of a collaborative. And in that collaborative were a group of environmental groups, government agencies, and these ranchers. These ranchers began capitulating and voluntarily giving up some of their property rights in return for special treatment and praise from political leaders from both sides of the aisle. And this has since spread all over the country as far as I'm concerned, but I believe it really started in Harney County. So with the sage-grouse issue, not only were we ranchers having to defend our rights against radical environmental groups, now we were having to defend our rights against neighboring ranchers, and it was heartbreaking. One meeting that will forever be etched in my mind, there was a bunch of us ranchers that were testifying in front of high-level U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and BLM employees, and we were going around the room and telling how this plan would affect us. And one elderly man, he's in his 80s, and his family, his ranch had been in the family for generations. He had done everything that the government had wanted on his private property, on his BLM and Forest Service. He spent thousands of dollars doing what they called habitat improvement for a sage-grouse. And he was in tears. This man, this rough, tough man that had put his blood, sweat, and tears into this century-old ranch was in tears. And he said that this will be the end of my ranch. This will be the end. I will have lost what generations before me had worked on. Now, everybody else in the room, we all were crying, and we took turns going around the room saying pretty much the same thing and trying to get our composure. And a fellow rancher who is a spokeswoman for this collaborative process I was telling you about got up, and this man that was crying, she'd known all of her life, and she claimed to be friends with a lot of people in the room. And she got up, and I quote, this is what she said: "You guys are all a bunch of damn whiners," only she said the Lord's name in vain. Then she proceeded to tell us how ignorant we were and that we could all work within this plan. Now, the reason I explain all of this is to say this. A lot of people have said over the last 2 years, about Harney County, you read it in newspapers and magazines, you've even seen it on TV. Oh, that poor Harney County, the refuge occupation divided the community. Well, I'll have you know, my community was divided long before Ammon Bundy, Ryan Bundy, and Lavoy Finicum set foot in Harney County. Oops, what did I do? Oh, sorry. Sorry, I'm getting emotional. This is an ownership map of Harney County today. If you can see it, the white is deeded private land. 75% of Harney County is land that the federal government claims ownership of. There's also some state land in there. We went from the richest county in the state to competing for the poorest county of the state. It goes back and forth with a couple other neighboring counties in the east. The best jobs now in our county are government jobs. If a young person wants to come home, they can't log, they can't come back to the family ranch. The only thing they can hope for if they want to come back to Harney County is to get a job working for the government. Oh, I did it again. This is a meme I found on the internet while we were calving, and I thought, man, this is so true. It says ranching is a noun. The art of losing money while working 100 or 400 hours a month to feed people who think you're trying to kill them. And isn't that the truth? I read that as the news was blaring, you know, how you know, farmers and ranchers are abusing animals, and you know, the herbicides we spray on it are killing people. So I thought that was very telling. This is a picture of the Hammonds. Stephen is on the left, his wife Erlina, Susie, and Dwight. My family has a big connection to the Hammond family. My husband Jeff graduated or grew up with Stephen and spent a lot of time at Dwight and Susie's house. He graduated from high school with Stephen and Erlina. Susie Hammond is one of my very best friends, and Dwight is the kindest man you'll ever meet. This is a picture on the left of my husband, is on the far left. Stephen Hammond in the middle. That was the last branding of ours that he was at before he went to prison the first time. And here's Dwight doing what he always did, hauling cows. And they're the type of people that if anybody needed their help, they would drop whatever they were doing and go assist anybody, whether they knew him well or not. And to federal prison the second time. This is as they're going into Terminal Island. That's actually the name of the prison they're in, a federal prison they're at. In March, I don't know how I'm doing. In March, this is a march in support of the Hammonds right before they turned themselves in. Thousands of people came to our little community in support. And then, of course, you all know what happened after that. Several men, in order to stand up for the Hammonds, occupied the Malheur Wildlife Refuge. Here's a picture of what things looked like at the refuge. There's press, there's families. There's probably thousands of people that came and went. And people drove by, the neighbors went about their business. This is a detailed map of the refuge headquarters in comparison to where Burns is located. It's about 30 or 40 miles away. So as you saw the pictures of what was going on at the refuge, this is what was going on in Burns. The sheriff's office and the courthouse, they barricaded themselves in. There was really no law enforcement in the rest of the county for 41 days, except for the standing army that moved in. This is the FBI compound. They took over the municipal airport in Burns. And here are some of the people that showed up. And the FBI, Homeland Security. Here's a picture of some armored trucks that came in. There was also planes and helicopters. That little disc on top of that, I mean, you guys might know this, but I didn't know it. I thought it was a satellite dish. There's guys that get behind that with their rifles pointing out there. And after Lavoy Finicum was killed and many of the refuge occupiers were arrested, that top left photo is a line of FBI Suburbans or something in Harney County. Down low is more of the armored vehicles. They began to set up roadblocks all around the refuge. And when I mean around the refuge, I mean it wasn't like a mile away. they had 3 different roadblocks, yeah, that were, I don't know, anywhere from 20 to 40 miles, 10, well, probably 10, one was 10 miles to 20 miles away from the refuge headquarters themselves. And I talked about this at the first Range Rights and Resources Symposium in Layton, Utah, and Trent Luce has played audio recordings of local ranchers being thrown to the gun at gunpoint and abused at these military-style roadblocks. This is one of the roadblocks. There's a pickup stop there. You can see that armored car with the disc. It looks like somebody's sitting up there, and then the military-type law enforcement. So after Lavoy Finicum was killed and locals were terrorized at these military-type roadblocks, Harney County ranchers decided they were going to protest the courthouse because this had to stop. So a lot of ranchers even had their horse trailers. They pulled up and they had made signs, and they were going to stand in front of the courthouse. There's somebody in the back of the pickup. It says premedited murder is a crime no matter who you represent. On the left is my husband at this protest with a sign that says free the Hammonds. Lower right is one of our friends, a local rancher. He's holding a sign that says ambushed and assassinated. But what my husband and his friends didn't realize, that when they showed up with their signs, there was counter-protesters already standing in front of the courthouse. And they were protesting the protesters in support of the government actions. There were people, you know, we're a small town, so the people on one side knew, and a lot of times were related to the people on the other side. And everybody started yelling at everybody, and it was pretty awful. And then one of our friends happened to have a horse in the back of his trailer when he went to this protest. So he unloaded his horse, he grabbed an American flag, he got on, and this is him heading for the sidewalk. What he did is he rode between the 2 protesting groups down the sidewalk, in between them with the American flag. And I think this is a sign of what we need more of. All of us food producers need to stand together, all of us, whether you grow olives, you grow calves. We need to stand together, and the food consumers need to stand beside us and support us. Because those of us residing in rural communities are the proverbial canary in the coal mine, and we're suffocating. What's happening to us will soon happen to the American population at large. Dwight and Stephen Hammond have a clemency petition right now sitting before the president. The president is the only person standing in the way of freedom, and Stephen spending 2 more years in prison, and Dwight, who was 77, spending 3 more years in prison. In closing, this is why my son's sitting here. This is a picture of Ian working. In that picture, he's trying to trot ahead of some cows, I guess. But Ian's story is that he's a senior this year at Burns High School. And I've been really vocal through this whole situation. And my husband and I, made the decision to stand up for what was right, say what we needed to say, and we were prepared to deal with the consequences, of being targeted next, of family and friends not speaking with us. But what we weren't prepared for is things being taken out on our children. And Ian is graduating from high school, and so he was going through, the whole senior thing where you apply for scholarships, you apply to colleges, and he had to write an essay to apply for this prestigious private university in Oregon. So he wrote this essay, and he said, "Mom, read over it." So I read it, and it was great. It was true. I cried. I cry a lot. But I said, "Ian, maybe you shouldn't give specifics on this. Maybe you should just in general, because if you write this, they're not going to accept you." And he said to me, he said, "Mom, the truth is the truth. And if they don't want the truth, then they don't want me, and I'm not supposed to be there." And he said, and besides, I can't believe you of all people are telling me to be quiet. But I wanted Ian to read the essay that he wrote in his application, that he attached to his application to this private university. And before he gets up here, because we'll close with that, I just wanted to tell you that he was accepted to that college. Not only was he accepted, but he was given a large scholarship. So here's Ian.
So this is my essay. I'm going to read it to you. I was born into a family of ranchers, loggers, farmers, and shepherds. Both sides of my family are filled with hard-working men and women that know what it means to depend on the land for everything. I was raised to understand that God has given mankind dominion over the earth, and that it is our duty as caretakers to ensure that the earth and its creatures are not wasted. Growing up on a cattle ranch in Harney County, Oregon, I have been part of agriculture, and I'm honored to have such a noble purpose as producing food for the country I love so much. In recent years, I have begun to notice more and more confrontations between agencies of the federal government and farmers and ranchers over land. The most significant cases of these are the clashes between those agencies and the Bundys in Nevada and the Hammonds, who are personal friends of my family in Oregon. Both conflicts have been over land use and resulted in government agencies taking extreme action against these families. In the Bundys' case, 53 ranchers were ranching on the same land in Clark County, Nevada since the 1800s. Using the desert tortoise as leverage, government entities regulated 52 of these ranches out of business. The Bundys were the only ranchers remaining. Abusing a court order to remove the Bundys' cattle from the Nevada desert, the Bureau of Land Management and other government agencies killed many of their cattle and were very aggressive towards the family. In the case of Dwight and Stephen Hammond, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service at the Malheur Wildlife Refuge and the BLM prompted a series of unfair confrontations culminating in them being convicted of terrorism for accidentally burning 140 acres of federal grassland and consequently serving 2 separate sentences for the same crime. The latter case being the main cause of the Oregon standoff, in which several armed men peacefully gathered at the Malheur Wildlife Refuge office and refused to leave until the Hammonds case was reviewed by the U.S. Congress and/or the U.S. Department of Justice. Unfair media coverage of the event, the poor efforts of an incompetent local police force, and over-aggressive, heavily armed FBI involvement instilled fear toward the occupiers who wanted to have town hall meetings and explain their actions. The Malheur occupation followed on the heels of several Occupy movements around the nation. Occupy Wall Street and Occupy Portland were comprised of many people camping out for months in protest. Yet in these Occupy protests, no militaristic force was deployed to stop them. The Malheur occupation was condemned simply because the media used the occupiers' possession of firearms to portray them as terrorists. The occupation took a deadly turn when Arizona rancher Lavoy Finicum was shot and killed by Oregon State troopers at a roadblock. All of these incidents could have been avoided had the government and court systems not abused their powers that are defined in the U.S. Constitution. The lawyers and judges that presided over the original cases for the Bundys, Hammonds, and other ranching families have failed to protect their property rights and forced the occupiers to feel as if they needed to defend their livelihood by taking extreme measures. As a child, I dreamed of following in the footsteps of my father, grandfather, and his grandfather before him to become a rancher and care for the land and provide food for families. But as a young man, I just realized that if someone is not in the position to defend what is right before God, the people, and the U.S. Constitution, then the way of life that I have come to love so much will be lost forever. For this reason, I have decided to pursue a career as an attorney, specializing in environmental or agricultural law. I believe that there is a war on agriculture and those that provide. Powerful environmental groups use corrupt regulations and frivolous lawsuits to make enemies of farmers and ranchers in order to advance their own agendas. I have now made the choice to follow a career in law when all I had previously wanted was to become a rancher like my family before me. I hope to become an element in the change that I wish to see happen, and if not, then I hope to at least stand as an example for those who question what is right. Thank you, sir. Thank you.